Sitting in traffic, it's easy to forget great driving even exists. And commute cars can be boring.
So we've gone back to the cars that inspired our show, now considered collector's cars that shouldn't be driven.
But we're setting out on 4 epic road trips, one in each direction of the compass, in search of amazing roads and new adventures. The 4 points in the great cars of the past. So here we are with my 1991 Nissan 300zx twin turbo. It's survived the West Coast trip. We only have 3 more to go and a lot of other things we want to do as well. But let's talk about what the reality is of having this 31-year-old car now and doing what we're doing. I bought it for $24,000, which felt like a halfway decent deal. And then I started driving it to discover what was wrong. I did that initial 500-mile road trip, then we did our huge West Coast trip. Things have been revealed. First off, the paint is not in great shape. The front, when I bought it, had a lot of little speckles on it from just road damage. And I realized there was no point in putting paint protection film on the front as it was. We were going to drive it, it was going to get more damage. Let's just let it get more damage, get it repainted later because it was already damaged enough. Guess what? I was right, it's getting worse. So those continue to just kind of pepper the front end. I don't love that, but it wasn't perfect to begin with. The other thing when I first bought the car is that it had a power steering leak, and I wasn't really sure what the story was on that. I kept refilling the reservoir, and then I started to notice it was getting quite a bit worse. I expected it was the HICAS system, because that's known to fail and can be problematic, that creates the rear wheel steering. It wasn't the HICAS at all. It was just the power steering system for the front end of the car. The return line for the power steering had a pretty substantial leak. In fact, it was so bad it was leaking down through the engine onto the steering rack itself and creating something I've never encountered before. The bushings holding the steering rack in place were so saturated with power steering fluid that they were now moist and sliding along the steering rack. So when you turned into a corner, the steering rack would shift a half inch and then the wheels would turn. It was the most bizarre sensation I've ever encountered in a car, and the first couple times it happened to me, it honestly felt dangerous because you couldn't get the car to turn in. A new power steering return line, cleaning up the entire rack, putting in a bunch of new bushings, and guess what? It steers like new. But I still wasn't done because it needed suspension. You saw me talk about it on the West Coast piece. If I switch it over to Sport, I actually physically bounce in the cabin, and Paul was noticing earlier when I'm in Sport, you can watch the rear of the car bounce. Of course, at this point, this car's 30 years old. There's a ton of coilovers. There's a ton of stuff available for this car. I want to keep it as close to the stock feeling as possible, so I ordered brand new versions of the OEM shocks. Now that means that's a shock that actually listens to that switch that goes from touring to sport. It's pretty stiff. I mean, compared to most modern cars in a sports setting, it's actually more stiff than many of those cars. But there used to be a constant buzz, and that's gone away. And now the combination of fixing the steering rack and that suspension makes the steering fantastic. I didn't even feel like I'd really driven this car until both of those were dialed, and I went, now that is really impressive. It does dial this car in with a steering precision that frankly has surprised me. I didn't know this car could be this good, but that's the reality of changing old parts.
I have decided that this 928 found me. As you know, I used to have a 928 S4, but I had to sell it because there were mechanical things that it needed. But when I went to look at this car, my brother-in-law said, "Hey, I found this cool car. It's a 928. Do you know anything about them?" And I thought, sure, I'm not looking, but I might as well be entertained and go take a look. And then he said, it's a 5-speed manual. Porsche built 80% of these with a 4-speed automatic transmission because they thought, GT car, you're on the road and this is where it shines. You want to go. But the manual brings it to life. I guess that's why I like it so much. And as soon as I got it home, my friend Andy Haas, who has a product design studio called Raptor Creative, he said, why don't you bring it over and we'll work on it? Because the first thing you want to do with a 928 when you buy one is change the timing belt and the water pump. That's just step one. When I took this car over to Andy's place, we thought, all right, let's just dive in. There's just a few oil leaks, and we discovered the cam tower gaskets were leaking. And then as soon as we pulled off the water pump and the timing belt, we found evidence of corrosion behind the water pump on the aluminum block. Most of this car is aluminum. Then we discovered somebody had poured green coolant into an aluminum engine. You want the gold coolant. We looked at each other and we said, we don't know what these head gaskets are going to be like. They're probably the originals. We've got to pull the engine. And he was game. I'm not a mechanic. I've never pulled an engine before. I've never worked on a car this in-depth. I've done some stuff, but he had the tools, he had the lift, and so I said, all right, let's dive in. And you always want to have a friend with a lift and the tools when you have an old car like this. What could possibly go wrong? What went wrong is that Porsche has engineered the 928 so that you have to remove or disassemble about 3 or 4 other things to get to the component that you want to change or remove. So at that point, we found ourselves cursing dead Porsche engineers, because I also discovered Porsche bolts are like Audi bolts. They're about 4 feet long when you're trying to remove them, and then it bumps into something else and you can't get it out and you have to remove that thing to get to the bolt, and then suddenly a day is gone. And every time we took a part off the car, it was corroded and old, and we thought, this is the original part. We'd take something off and then realize, we're in here already. That other thing needs to be changed. Oh, and by the way, have you checked the hoses? We found from the fuel rail that the short little rubber hose from the fuel rails going to the injectors was cracked. So I was about 500 miles or so from an engine fire. That made me feel really good. But at least we dove in, and Andy made me clean every single part. He made me clean and degrease everything on here. And at first I hated him for it, but then now that it's finished, I'm proud of this car. I'm proud of this engine. And I have a connection to this car like I've never had. Come on, baby. Be nice to me. It runs! It runs! It runs! It runs! I cannot tell you what a relief this is. I'm so happy right now. I want to cry. Oh my God.
Yep, I put aftermarket wheels on this car, and I know there are purists out there on the forums that are already angry at me, but okay, let's talk this through. If you have the original wheels, good for you. How much do you drive your car? Because it's getting incredibly difficult to find tires for those original wheels. And they're staggered fitment. They're 16s with a staggered fitment. The ability to find a full matched pair is getting harder and harder. Interesting side note on those original wheels, they all have air veins in them for brake cooling. But that means you have individual air veins for each wheel because they are staggered and they have a side. I wanted to take the staggered fitment and go to a square fitment. I went from 225 245s to 235s all the way around. I also don't really like the original stock design. I know you're hate writing right now. You're typing as fast as you can about how great the original wheels are. I kept them to keep them pristine. When I get rid of the car, I'll take those wheels and I'll give them to the next owner who probably won't drive the car this much. I actually really like these Inkies. They're 17s. I was able to get normal tires across the board, and they are lighter than the stock wheel. Our sponsor Nokian stepped alongside us. They had a easy to find 235 to go on all 4 of these wheels in their great all-weather tires. So we have a WGR4 on this, and I love the look of these wheels. I think it has modernized this design, which is somewhat timeless to begin with. I think it's the wheels that keep it older. The wheels here have modernized it. You may hate them, I understand, but those are the reasons I did it.
After Todd and I's first road trip from San Francisco to Seattle, the Cars of the Past #1, the engine was running great, it's smooth, there's still a little bit of vacuum assist that I need to figure out, but other than that, the engine is great. It's just everything else on the car that hasn't been touched in 39 years. So, after the trip, I had to leave it with Bristow's Auto in Tacoma, Washington, because Pete is a friend, he has an excellent shop, and I had to add another $8,000 worth of parts and labor to get it back to health because I couldn't get the car out of gear, which meant the intermediate plate needed to be replaced. I also had to have new brakes all around, a new clutch master cylinder, bleed the brakes, bleed the clutch master cylinder and the brake master cylinder, and by the way, they share the same reservoir. Thanks, Porsche. But what I did learn from this entire experience is, despite spending $13,500 for the car, and then I put $20,000 or so into the engine rebuild because I was buying parts and shipping parts back, and I also took care of Andy, so it was about 20 grand or so into the build, plus another 8. I'm looking at about $40,000 into this thing. Yeah, it has value to me. But what I ultimately learned is almost every part from every Porsche built since the 1950s is available at your Porsche dealer. They can look it up on their online system. And whether it's sitting on a warehouse in Germany somewhere, or it could be made again, those parts are available. And that is the biggest reason, I think the only reason for justifying old Porsche ownership. So I'm happy. It makes me confident in continuing to drive this. And it makes me confident for future generations that will still discover old Porsches and old cars. I hope every car company kind of still does this, because this is why we drive, this investment, and it's worth it. I say that now that I'm far past the engine rebuild, but it's worth it.
So all told, with the wheels and tires, with the suspension fix, with the steering fix, with everything I've done to the car, oil changes, tires, all of the above, we're looking at $3,900. So 24 grand to buy it, $3,900 so far in maintenance and upkeep. I think I'm doing okay. And look at it. It's still gorgeous. And there's lots more to come.